On October 12, 1969, DJ Russ Gibb from WKNR received a very mysterious call from one of his listeners. The listener was identified only as Tom, and Tom encouraged Russ and his listeners to listen to two Beatle tracks. Those two Beatle tracks were Revolution Number 9 and Strawberry Fields Forever. Now, around this time, college student Tim Harper wrote an article for his college newspaper. Now, that article opened up a whole new can of worms. Beatle fans were searching for clues everywhere. And guess what, folks? Those clues just weren't on their songs. Those clues appeared to even be on their album covers. Now, the story goes that on November 11th, 1966, Paul McCartney and the Beatles were in the recording studio and evidently got into a heated discussion that resulted in Paul McCartney leaving in disgust, getting into his Aston Martin, picking up along the route a young lady named Rita, and right after getting into a horrible car crash that he did not survive. In fact, some clues seem to indicate that he was even decapitated. All right, folks, this is going to be part one of a couple of videos that I'm going to be putting out regarding the whole Paul McCartney death hoax, death myth, or death reality. You see, after that call we talked about and that article we talked about, it seemed that every monkey's uncle got in on the act, didn't they? After all, the Beatles were big, and any discussion on this group sold papers, sold TV shows, and sold radio shows as well. We even got famous radio DJ Alex Bennett involved doing a serious research on the whole subject, as well as famed attorney F. Lee Bailey doing a special, almost putting Paul McCartney on trial. All right, so after that supposed accident, supposedly, the three Beatles, of course, were in shock, and they were even contacted by British Secret Intelligence. Together, the British Secret Intelligence and the Beatles put together a plan. First of all, they found one William Campbell, supposedly a contest winner in a Paul McCartney look-alike contest. He looked so close to Paul that he only needed minor corrective surgery. That would explain why Paul McCartney wound up with a mustache for the first time as a Beatle on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The eagle-eyed fans noticed that Paul McCartney actually had a scar on his lip despite that mustache, never mind the fact that Paul McCartney actually cut his lip in a moped accident. He even knocked out one of his teeth. You can see the results of that even earlier than Sgt. Pepper, when the Beatles released rock's first two so-called MTV videos, in my mind anyway, Paperback Writer and Rain. If you take a close look at those videos, you'll notice that Paul is missing a tooth. He's just stuck some white gum up there, but if you notice, it doesn't quite look the same from shot to shot. You see, he had to keep moving it so that they could do the video. And to those suspicious clue hunters, it seemed rather odd that the rest of the Beatles grew facial hair all at the same time. They thought that was to deflect our eyes from the fact that, well, Paul wasn't Paul anymore. But you know, it wasn't long before fans found other clues to Paul McCartney's demise. And as things went along, to tell you the truth, many of the clues that were given as legitimate were just based on absolute rubbish. And some of that rubbish we're going to cover in tonight's video, because tonight we're going to focus on the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, if there was ever a cornucopia of clues regarding Paul McCartney dying, this album, well, It takes the cake, doesn't it? Now, the album cover basically came together like this. You had the front photo, right? You had the inner gate sleeve. Make sure everybody can see that. And of course, the famous back cover that for the first time included Beatle lyrics. And there are clues galore on this album. Now, first of all, just look at the setting here, right? Okay, it's obviously set up as a funeral with tons of photos of famous and not so famous people on the cover behind the Beatles. We also have the famous waxed figures of the Beatles in attendance, as well as the Beatles as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band center stage. In front of them is a flower arrangement. And when you put all of those things kind of together, your first impression is that this is a funeral, a memorial at the least. Now, I'm not going to get into the plethora of people in the background there, okay? Although there are a few clues there as well. Now, one of the very first things that came to clue hunters was that in that flower arrangement, one of those arrangements was of Paul's famous left-hand Hofner bass. And the very astute could even see that those flowers spelled out the name Paul with a question mark right behind it. And there are only 3 strings on that left-hand bass. The bass is a 4-string instrument, folks. So all of these fans started thinking, well, this is the way of the Beatles telling us that the Paul McCartney on the cover is no more the real Paul McCartney than the wax dummy that's on the cover as well. And those 3 strings represented the only Beatles that were left: John, George, and Ringo. And as far as the flower arrangement that spells Beatles, if you take a closer look at it, just preceding Beatles is an almost 3. In other words, 3 Beatles left. To the far right, you notice that there's a Shirley Temple doll that has been dressed in a Rolling Stones sweatshirt. On her knee is a toy car resembling Paul McCartney's Aston Martin. And the old figure that's holding the Shirley Temple doll is holding her, and on her left hand, Paul McCartney was left, is a bloody driving glove. Now, the one thing I did want to focus on all of those background characters behind the Beatles was the hand that's extended behind Paul McCartney's head. Now, I'm not going to get into that tonight, but it is a death clue, folks. That'll be in a latter part of this series, because let's just say this is not the first time that Paul McCartney would be photographed with a mysterious hand over his head. But take a look at the instruments that the Beatles, as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, are holding. Paul McCartney is the only one to hold a wooden black instrument. All the other Beatles are holding brass instruments. Many fans saw that as not only as a sign of mourning Paul, but they also brought up that it's the only instrument made of wood, and that because it was made of wood, it represented a coffin. Now, the centerpiece of the front cover and smoking gun, evidently, is none other than Ringo Starr's drumhead. If you notice the title, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, there are 2 portions of that title that have the same font: Sgt. Pepper's Club Band. You see, Lonely Hearts is placed right in the middle of that drumhead. And some very creative fans found out that if you held a mirror absolutely to the center of that, instead of Lonely Hearts, you got this message: 1, 1, 1, X, he die. And that diamond, what is that diamond pointing to? Follow it upwards, and it is identifying Fa Paul. Now, when I first saw that, I thought it meant 1, 1, 1, and an X. In other words, one of the Beatles was X'd out. And then how? Well, he die. But you could also look at those numbers in another way. The first two ones could mean the 11th month, and that one before an X would be 9. 11, 9. So now that gives us a date. 1109, he die. Who? Paul. How do we get 1966? By those other clues that we discussed. His accident, facial scars and everything, and most clues beginning at this point. But let's get on to the inner gatefold sleeve. First of all, it appears the Beatles are carrying Paul here. You can clearly see his knees as he's put himself into an almost lotus position, and the Beatles appear to be standing right next to him. And then there's that mysterious patch on Paul McCartney's shoulder with the initials that appeared to many fans to be OPD. They surmised this stood for officially pronounced dead. Actually, the patch's initials was OPP, which stood for the Ontario Provincial Police. But McCartney even seemed to think that it was an OPD patch because he said that it stood for the Ontario Police Department. Now on the back cover, Paul McCartney is facing away from us, isn't he? If you notice, down the small of his back, his uniform has 3 black buttons. Again, like those 3 black strings on the base on the front cover. Many fans surmised that there were only 3 Beatles left, and really in this photo, we only see the faces of those 3 Beatles. Now right about Paul McCartney's head are the lyrics to Within You, Without You. Many people saying that this whole song was written by George about Paul being dead. But if you look at George's hand, what is he pointing to? He's pointing to the lyrics, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. Of course, it didn't help when Life magazine in November of 1966 put out an issue with Paul McCartney and his family on the cover, but if you held the cover up to the light and looked at what was on the other side of that, you'd see a car ad. The car blocked Paul McCartney's body, only leaving his head, leaving some fans to speculate that this was yet another clue that Paul McCartney had been decapitated. Now, why would anybody even fall for this idea? Well, it was the 60s, first of all, and we had already seen bands such as the Beach Boys when Brian Wilson decided to stay behind and work on recordings and songwriting. They brought on Glenn Campbell and Bruce Johnson to take his place for their live performances. What was so different about the Beatles secretly just having a face on hand with John, George, and Ringo still supplying the music? And yet some fans still remained unconvinced, thinking that the Beatles were supplying us with hints on the artwork on their albums and in the lyrics to their songs. Some fans reached back to Yesterday and Today, the album For America by the Beatles that had the famous Butcher cover, and the picture that was pasted over that seemed to indicate, especially if you turned it on its side, that Paul was lying in a coffin. Those same fans pointed out that on Rubber Soul, while the other Beatles are relatively facing forward on the cover, Paul is notably facing sideways, thus pointing him out as an exception. But why? Many felt it was a clue that he had passed on and that they were letting their fans down gently. On Rubber Soul, the title alone was a clue that whoever this Paul McCartney was, he wasn't the real Soul. He was a Rubber Soul, a rubber-stamped replacement. On Revolver, Paul McCartney's drawing is facing away from the Beatles, another clue evidently, with the only problem on these albums being is they were released before Paul McCartney supposedly died. But what about those songs? With over 30 songs that some fans claim that have clues pointing to Paul McCartney's death, some fans questioned as to whether the Beatles were doing this themselves, whether they were involved in passing these clues on. Songs like Revolution Number 9, it starts off with an engineer saying number 9, number 9, number 9. And this repeats 13 times. They noted that Paul McCartney had 9 letters in his last name, and the fact that they repeated this sentence 13 times indicated that it had to be Paul McCartney, because Paul McCartney is 13 letters. And could that number 9 indicate November 9th, 1966? With apocalyptic sounds and the sound of flames and a voice screaming, "Let me out," you almost feel like this was a purposeful collage by the Beatles addressing these very rumors. And when you played the beginning of that record backwards, number 9 became "Turn Me On, Dead Man. Turn Me On, Dead Man." On George Harrison's Blue Jay Way, when he sings "Please Don't Be Very Long," when you play that backwards, evidently it says Paul is bloody. Paul is very, very bloody. And on Strawberry Fields Forever, John seems to claim that he buried Paul. Never mind the fact that John said, "I said cranberry sauce," and the fact that you can clearly hear cranberry sauce on the anthology outtakes. But you can't blame fans for trying. After all, in the same song, John used Morse code to tap out the name John. So there were shenanigans by the Beatles at times with these lyrics. Sometimes, though, these were just coincidences. So whether this was an accident or not, the Beatles were known to get mysterious and put very strange things on their albums. And it doesn't stop there. A Day in the Life, John talks about somebody blowing their mind out in a car. This seemed to be exactly what the rumors were indicating. Paul blowing his mind or losing his head in a car accident. Sgt. Pepper included Lovely Rita. We've already talked about that. On She's Leaving Home, we get an indication of exactly when Paul died. 5 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Incidentally, November 9th, 1966 was on a Wednesday. Some fans felt that Drive My Car was a reference to the accident and Paul picking up Rita. Come on, baby, you can drive my car. The hardcore clue finders were including songs like I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, Yesterday, and Act Naturally, all part of their clue base. The Beatles trying to act naturally even though Paul was not with them, so as to not get anybody suspicious. And of course, Dr. Robert was the guy who signed Paul McCartney's death certificate. These kinds of fans said that "we can work it out" was the deal the Beatles made between themselves and management. I mean, this whole rock and roll mystery had everybody buzzing back in the day. Some included the run out on some versions of Sgt. Pepper, where the Beatles appeared to be saying that they will blank you like Superman. They said this was the Beatles hinting that they were screwing their audiences over. Now, these kinds of clues need a whole lot of supposition, don't they, folks? But there were other songs like Revolution that had a little bit more to them, almost to the point that you kind of gotta wonder if the Beatles weren't screwing us over a little bit here. In 1995, Paul McCartney, after all, admitted that they were tacking stuff all the time on their recordings. On I Am the Walrus, the title is actually I Am the Walrus, No You're Not, said Little Nicola. When you compare that to Glass Onion and him saying, here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul, that title takes on a whole different complexion, doesn't it? Stupid Bloody Tuesday, mentioned in that song, is the night the Beatles got into the fight, and by the time Paul McCartney left, it would be Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. Paul being in a car accident takes even on more weight when you consider that on I Am the Walrus, John wrote the basic portion of that song around 2 notes. The 2 notes he heard while an ambulance, an English ambulance, passed him by. On Only a Northern Song, George Harrison admitted there's something not right in the song. That's part of the lyrics, admitting that the band's not sounding quite right. Some have claimed that in the nautical portion of Yellow Submarine, you can hear John saying, "Paul is dead," and even elsewhere repeating the word dead man. With parts of the song on All You Need Is Love where John seems to be indicating or supposing that Paul is dead there, as soon as that portion comes in, on view comes the word no, right in front of Paul's face. In the film Magical Mystery Tour, Paul is the only one wearing a black rose, right? The rest of them had red. Now, Paul has said that that was all they had left. I've kind of got to wonder about that. How many people have a bunch of black roses hanging around? It's not a common color, but that's the story, and they're sticking to it. Ringo told us that he was in a car crash and that he had lost his hair. According to the rumor, he had lost more than his hair. He lost everything his hair was attached to. Now, on the White Album, you have I'm So Tired and then Paul McCartney's Blackbird. As I'm So Tired in, you hear mumbling at the mic. When you play that backwards, you hear Paul is dead, miss him, miss him, miss him. With Blackbird following that, what is a blackbird if not a raven, and isn't that a macabre symbol of death? John tells us on Come Together that 1 and 1 and 1 is 3, indicating that there were only 3 Beatles left. Now, the artwork on the albums that would be up for debate, for example, Magical Mystery Tour, has the Beatles pictured on the cover in animal costumes. Of course, we're told later that the walrus was Paul, but clearly the walrus is John. In the 24-page booklet, there's tons of art that indicate that's where we see the black rose with Paul. That's where you see the photo of Paul sitting at the desk and the sign, I was, right there for us all to see. On pages 10 and 13, Paul is not wearing any shoes. We'll get to that in just a moment. Ringo's drumhead says, love the 3 Beatles, indicating that one of the Beatles are no longer on board. If you took this album cover, turned it upside down, held it to a mirror, and squinted your eyes, tapping your heels 3 times, saying to yourself, there's no place like home, you could see a telephone number where you could call and find out all the grisly details. Again, Revolver, although released a little too early, seemed to have plenty of death clues. Paul singing I Was Alone, I Took a Ride. John singing for Paul, I Know What It's Like to Be Dead. Get to the White Album, it's all in the photos and the poster. Paul's photo out of the 4 is once again different, much more detailed and close-up than the other 3 Beatles. Paul's lying in a tub with only his head there. Again, evidently, another clue as to his decapitation. One photo shows ghostly hands hovering over Paul, and there are a plethora of photos on many Beatle photos where hands are extended over Paul's head, evidently indicating death in some sort of way. And we're not even going to get into Manson's theories on the Beatles. That man has gotten enough press for 3 lifetimes. Of course, on Abbey Road, the Beatles appear to be walking in a funeral procession. John being the minister, Ringo the pallbearer, Paul being the dead guy, with George following him in work clothes as the grave digger. A Volkswagen Beetle in the background with the license plate 28 if indicates that Paul would have been 28 if he had lived. Never mind the fact that at the time that photo was taken, that Paul McCartney was 27 years old. Paul is out of step in that photo. He's also got a cigarette in his right hand. That happens in several photos, one on Magical Mystery Tour. Paul's left-handed. On the back, we have the Beatles there on the wall with a crack running through the S, indicating to some clue hunters there was trouble in paradise. They also point to the pop marks on the wall that if you trace it, it makes the number 3. Never mind the fact that you can trace it and make the number 8 or 5 quite easily. You know, the 60s were a magical time, and we saw such a miraculous amount of music coming forth that it wasn't hard to believe that the really weird could happen. And it speaks of the Beatles' mythology here. Their myth is so strong that this rumor persists even to today. I know some of you have written me and told me you believe it. Hell, this whole death clue even made it into an issue in Detective Comics of Batman, where Batman has to find out if Saul Cartwright is dead or not. Turns out it was the other 3 that were dead. Saul was just fine.